Chapter 16. This is from the official NASA Procedures for Contact with Intelligent Extraterrestrial Life Manual. Contact outside of U.S. borders. Given that the United States occupies less than 7% of the Earth's total land mass and less than 2% of the Earth's surface period, there is obviously a large statistical chance that primary contact with IEL will occur outside the borders of the United States. In fact, given that oceans cover 70% of the Earth, there's a great chance that IEL will make contact over an ocean first. DEXA is extremely prepared for this scenario and will work with foreign governments to facilitate the first meeting with IEL no matter where it happens. If you happen to be in another country when primary contact first occurs, for purposes of U.S. government work, or even if you were on a fortuitously timed vacation there, proceed with the steps in this manual as if you were still in the United States. The arrival of IEL will have repercussions for the entire world and must be handled correctly. Thus, international boundaries are a secondary concern. Freeze-dried milk solids. Lunar day 252, T-minus 14 hours to evacuation. "What's up?" Kira asked as we hurried out of Chang's residence. Chang didn't follow us. He stayed back in his room. Maybe he had other things to do, as he'd claimed, although I had the sense that he was so annoyed at Nina that he didn't want to see anyone else for a bit. "Another emergency," I said, "in the mess hall." From Chang's door, we could see the mess through the corner of the greenhouse. To my surprise, no one seemed to be there. In fact, there didn't seem to be anyone anywhere on the base. The corridors along the residences were completely empty, as was the rec room across the hall. For once, no one was using the VR system. Obviously, everyone could have been on the side of the base I couldn't see, where the science pod and the bathrooms and the maintenance offices were, or they could have been in the residences, but I couldn't hear any voices either, which was unusual. I wondered if there had been a problem with the oxygen system and that everyone had passed out from hypoxia. Kira looked concerned as well. "Come on," she said, and we ran toward the mess. It didn't take long to get there. Only a few bounds down the corridor, and as we rounded the greenhouse, it became evident that the mess was completely empty, even though my parents had just asked me to come there. The science pod and the gym were empty too, which was very, very unsettling. If everyone had collapsed from hypoxia, there should have been at least some bodies around. I swung back around toward the greenhouse, at which point almost all of our fellow Moonies leaped out from where they'd been crouched at the base of the wall, hidden out of view, and screamed, "Surprise!" Now, under different circumstances, the surprise party would have been a very lovely effort on everyone's part. They had curled pages from the residence guide into conical party hats and decorated them festively. They'd inflated surgical gloves to make balloons, although with all the fingers sticking out, they looked more like cow's udders. They had even made confetti, which Violet and the other kids flung in the air. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best day for a surprise party. I was already on edge, worried about oxygen leaks and killers on the loose. So when everyone jumped out and startled me, I screamed in terror. And so did Kira, who was equally on edge. Both of us leaped several feet in the air, given the low gravity, and I lost my grip on the syringe I'd been holding. It flew into the batch of inflated surgical gloves that Roddy Marquez was holding and pierced 3 of them in one shot. They all exploded with a series of loud bangs, frightening Inez Marquez, who started bawling. The syringe itself ended up jabbed in Cesar's thigh, where it stuck like a dart in a bullseye. Now, it turns out Cesar had a fear of needles. He made a surprisingly high-pitched shriek and then passed out, nearly taking Kamoze Iwanyi down with him. This stopped the celebration dead. All of the Moonies had been about to burst into "Happy Birthday to You," but no one got past that first syllable, "ha," except Violet, who obliviously kept singing. And when Violet sang "Happy Birthday," she did it as operatically as possible. The only Moonies who weren't there were the Schobergs, naturally, Chang, obviously, and Nina, who had probably never celebrated anything in her life. Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez quickly ran to Cesar's side to check on him and gasped when she saw the syringe. "Why were you carrying this?" she asked me accusingly. "Chang found it in his residence," I said, deciding it wasn't time to go into the whole story. It, it might still have a little cyanide in it. What? Dr. Marquez gasped. The killer planted it on Chang, Kira said quickly, to frame him for killing Lars. In all of the commotion, she had forgotten that a lot of Moonies hadn't been told that the poisoning wasn't an accident, particularly the children. This revelation was enough to stop even Violet in the midst of her song. Someone killed Lars? Inez yelped and then started crying even louder. No, actually, they only tried to kill him, Kira said quickly, which didn't help very much. We should get Cesar to the medical bay right away, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez said. Although he was only a teenager, Cesar was still one of the biggest Moonies. Even so, Dr. Balnikov handled him easily. He picked Cesar up, cradled him in his arms, and hustled him off with his mother. Dr. Marquez followed along. Do you think I can help? He asked meekly. I doubt it, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez said. He needs a real doctor. But I am a real doctor, Dr. Marquez protested. You're just an astrophysicist. Then tend to Inez, for Pete's sake, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez told him. Inez Marquez was still crying, having been ignored in the uproar over Cesar. In fact, a fragment of one of the surgical gloves was still draped over her head, like a little latex yarmulke. It occurred to me that the syringe was an important piece of evidence, but given that it was still stuck in Cesar's leg, it seemed like bad manners to ask for it back at the moment. In any event, my parents had now come to my side. They were terribly upset and embarrassed about how badly the surprise party had worked out. I am so sorry, my mom said, hugging me tightly. We all thought this would be a nice surprise, and your birthday hasn't gone the way we'd hoped. And so, we didn't mean to frighten you like that, Dad put in. It's all right, I said. Really, I'm sorry I ruined everything. Close by, Dr. Howard was comforting Kira as well, one of his rare moments of emotional engagement. He wasn't hugging her, though. They were just talking things through. It's not ruined, Mom assured me. We only got off on the wrong foot, but we still put together a wonderful birthday meal for you. And it turned out that they had. At least they'd put together the best birthday meal possible, given that it was made almost entirely of space food. First and foremost, Dr. Goldstein had harvested everything that remained from the greenhouse. When the produce was divvied up, it didn't amount to much per person. 6 pea pods, 5 cherry tomatoes, 3 strawberries, a few slices of cucumber, and a smattering of bell pepper. But it was still way more fresh food than any of us had eaten in months. Then all the kids were allowed to pick whatever we wanted to eat from the food storage. Since NASA had sent a year's worth of space food per person and we weren't about to haul it all back, there was plenty for everyone. True, the rest would be left in storage in case NBA got going again, as it had a shelf life of 500 years, but certainly no one was going to need it for a while. I didn't have a favorite food so much as foods I didn't hate quite as much as the others, but once again it made a difference. I opted for 2 servings of shrimp cocktail. And finally, there was cake and ice cream. Or should I say, cake-like substance sprinkled with globules of free-dried gelatin-coated milk solids. Since we weren't allowed to have open flames, we couldn't have any candles, so Mom and Violet had made candle cutouts. But I appreciated the effort that everyone had gone to, and for a little while, I actually forgot about the threat of our diminishing oxygen supply and being blackmailed to track down Lars Schoberg's killer. Chang arrived not far into dinner and joined the party. If he was still upset at Nina, he didn't show it. Nina and the Schobergs never showed, but that was probably for the best. And all in all, it was the best meal I'd had at MBA in a long time. At least until Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez returned from the medical bay. She came directly to where I was sitting with my family, Kira and Dr. Howard. We were all having a good time, polishing off our desserts. Dr. Howard was even engaged for once, discussing an idea he'd had to improve the quality of space ice cream by amping up the viscosity in the compression process. Or something like that. I was having trouble understanding it. While Violet was wrapping up her 5th rendition of Happy Birthday, this time in Pig Latin. I'm sorry to interrupt the party, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez said, but I have some questions about that syringe. Is Cesar all right? Mom asked. It appears so, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez replied. There was very little poison in the syringe to begin with, although that it was cyanide. Not enough ended up in Cesar's leg to be dangerous, but we still gave him the full complement of antidotes just to be safe. We also gave Cesar a mild sedative. He has a slight fear of needles. Huh, really? Kira said with mock sincerity. I didn't notice. I observed Dr. Balnikov across the room, returning from the medical bay himself. He sat down at a table with Chang, Dr. Merritt, and Dr. Jenke. He and Chang both put on a show of simply being co-workers, not betraying the slightest hint of their relationship. I also noticed Dr. Marquez was glaring at his wife. Possibly he was unhappy that she had come directly to us and not to her own family. Or maybe he was still smarting from her insult about his medical abilities earlier. Or maybe things were just strained in their relationship. Anyhow, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez said, I need some clarity on where the syringe came from. You said the killer planted it on Chang. Yes, I said. They left it in his room to make it look like he'd tried to poison Lars. And how did you get it? Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez asked. Well, Chang gave it to us to give to Nina, I explained. Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez glanced across the mess at Chang and then lowered her voice. Then how do you know for sure that it was planted in Chang's room? Violet gave a gasp of surprise. You think Chang could be the... She didn't get the last word out because Mom slapped her hand over Violet's mouth before she could announce it to the whole mess hall. Sorry, sweetie, Mom told her, but you have to watch what you say out loud in front of everyone. If Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez thinks Chang might be the killer, that's our secret. Understand? Violet nodded that she did, and so Mom took her hand off of Violet's mouth. Violet immediately announced, way too loud, Well, I wasn't going to say Dr. B thought Chang was the killer. I was only going to say that she... This time it was Dad who slapped his hand over her mouth. We all glanced furtively over toward Chang to see if he'd heard, and since we all did it at the same time, it wasn't very furtive at all. Chang had heard, of course. He gave Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez a nice, mock-friendly wave, which made Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez shrink in embarrassment. Perhaps you shouldn't have brought this up in front of Violet, Dad told her pointedly. Or at our son's birthday dinner, Mom added, even more pointedly. I'm sorry, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez apologized, but this is important. Chang had a big grudge against Lars Schoberg and the intelligence to create cyanide. Honestly, that describes almost every person on this base, Dr. Howard observed, including myself. Chang is also known to have a temper, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez went on. He and Lars have come to blows on many occasions. Well, I guess that's why the killer framed him then, Kira said. If I was going to frame anyone for murdering Lars, I'd pick Chang too. Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez gave her a wary look. How can you be so sure that he was framed? If the syringe was in his room, that sure seems like a lot of evidence against him. It seemed to me that Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez was pressing us quite hard to admit that Chang might be guilty. However, instead of making me question Chang, her insistence made me grow suspicious of Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez herself. I wondered if she had been the one to put the syringe in Chang's room, and now she was panicking because it hadn't implicated him as strongly as she'd hoped. Or maybe she was trying to protect someone else in her family. Maybe Dr. Marquez had been behind the attempted murder. As a doctor, even a bad one, he probably knew something about cyanide, and I could imagine him making the lame attempt to frame Chang. Or maybe Roddy had done it. If anyone in that family knew how to get past the computer systems and unlock Chang's door, it would be Roddy. Roddy didn't have as big a grudge against Lars as he did against Patton, who'd bullied him relentlessly at MBA, but... And once again it occurred to me that Lars Schoberg might not have been the definite target for the poison. I mean, yes, he was the only one who ever ate NASA lutefisk, but perhaps not everybody knew that. The killer might have been targeting Patton Schoberg instead, or Lily, or Sonia. After all, the lutefisk was a Swedish delicacy, and the Schobergs were the only Swedes at MBA. If Roddy had been targeting Lars, or Patton, it made sense that he might have gotten the dosage for the poison wrong. After all, Roddy was only a kid, Maybe he underestimated how much he would need for a man as big as Lars. Or maybe he simply didn't make enough. I suddenly felt guilty for considering Roddy as a murderer. I mean, after all, he was my age, and it didn't make sense that a kid would have done something so horrible. But then nothing about this case made sense. I found myself growing annoyed at Nina for dragging me into the investigation, and at Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez for bringing it up again in the middle of my birthday dinner. To my side, Kira was finishing up her defense of why Chang had obviously been framed, which had been probably been a recitation of all of Chang's reasons. I'd been too distracted with my own thoughts to pay attention to it. She must have done a good job because everyone else at the table appeared convinced, except Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez. Consider this, the doctor proposed. What if Chang was the killer, so to deflect attention from himself, he faked a lousy job of framing himself? Elena, Dr. Howard said, don't take this the wrong way, but that's an idiotic theory. Dr. Howard wasn't that adept at interpersonal relationships. Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez recoiled, offended. How am I not supposed to take that the wrong way? Dr. Howard didn't even bother to respond to this. Instead, he said, Chang isn't any more of a suspect than anyone else here. Placing the murder weapon in his own room would be far more likely to draw attention to himself rather than deflect it, as evidenced by the fact that we are discussing his possible guilt right now. Ergo, framing himself, or simply keeping the syringe at all, would be moronic, and Chang is not moronic. Fine, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez said bitterly. If you're so smart, why don't you tell me who poisoned Lars Schoberg? To be honest, I haven't given it much thought, Dr. Howard said. You haven't? Violet asked, surprised. Dad finally had removed his hand from her mouth. I've been thinking about it plenty. Really? Mom asked, unable to hide her amusement. Yes, Violet said. I think Sonia Schoberg did it. Why? I asked. Because she's mean, Violet said. Mean, 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 mean. The meanest person I've ever met. She even has a mean face. Like this. Violet scrunched her face up into what was actually a decent imitation of Sonia's permanent scowl. Also, she hates her husband. Now, this last bit caught everyone at the table by surprise. How do you know that? Dad asked. Well, Violet explained, one day Inez and I were pretending to be unicorns on the catwalk outside the Schoberg's room, and I heard Sonia screaming something in Swedish over and over and over at Lars. It was like, Ja, ha tarde, but more Swedishy. And Inez and I were wondering what it meant, so I asked the base computer to translate it, and the base computer said she was saying, I hate you. We all looked at each other, impressed. That's some good detective work, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez said. Duh, Violet said. I'm a good detective. I helped find Nina when she went missing. You did, I admitted. I'm not surprised Sonia hates him, Kira said. Everybody says she only married Lars because of his money. Who's everyone? Dad asked. Everyone, Kira repeated, like all the gossip sites and the shows and everything. I mean, the guy looks like a toad, and Sonia was a model. She used to be beautiful before she let all those doctors mess up her face. So she probably never even liked the guy, except it didn't matter, because they had 15 houses and each one of them was enormous, so they probably never even had to see each other. But then Lars booked this trip up here, and instead of it turning out to be amazing, Sonia ends up cooped up in a tiny room with Lars and their dim-wit kids for 3 months. Maybe she couldn't take it anymore. Well, I've heard many times that money is the number one motive for murder, Mom said, and with Lars gone, Sonia inherits billions. If I had billions of dollars, I'd give it away to charity, Violet pronounced. And although I'd build myself a castle first. Oh, and I'd build a safari park and genetically engineer a unicorn. Ooh, Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez cooed. That's a great idea, but unicorns are beautiful. Now, this struck me as odd. It wasn't unusual for Violet to say something like this, but Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez didn't strike me as the unicorn type. They are, Violet agreed. Did you know that they poop rainbows? Now, this seemed odd as well, even for Violet. Although now that she mentioned it, I couldn't get the image of unicorns pooping rainbows out of my head. Maybe you can't either. It was as though I had lost control of some part of my mind. It seemed to be affecting my vision, too, because Violet's skin had changed color slightly. She was looking a little more blue than usual. And so was Dr. Brahmaputra Marquez. It was hard to tell, given her dark skin, but there was definitely something bluish around her lips. Oh my God, Mom gasped. She suddenly seemed extremely concerned, as did Dad. Both of them were checking their pulses. At the next table over, Dr. Marquez suddenly squawked in alarm. Inez, what's wrong? Inez was slumping at his side and babbling incoherently. We're getting hypoxic, Dad announced. The oxygen levels must be dropping. At which point, alarms went off throughout MBA. Then the voice of the base computer rang out through the halls, informing us that there was a major emergency. The oxygen system was severely compromised. We all needed to evacuate immediately.